play. United we win.
Deep right field. Another absolute bomb over the flag court.
We are family.
Outstanding effort again.
We're busting ours to kick yours.
That's big time.
Minus 15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he belt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Brendan Mortensen alongside Annie Klaff, coming at you an hour later than usual. I end every podcast by saying that we are live at 11 a.m. on YouTube and Facebook, and most of the time we're just not. Yeah. Because there are either technical difficulties or some other sort of difficulty, and then we're just not. We try to be live at 11 a.m. every week. I swear we really do.
We do.
It really just doesn't end up happening for us.
Technology is not our friend.
No.
Most of the time on Wednesdays specifically of the week.
I'm going to change it at the end to we are going to try our best to be with you at 11 a.m. on Facebook and YouTube. Hopefully by the time the regular season starts, we will have everything ironed out. It's spring training for everybody, including the technology that we are using. So we're trying to get there. Promise. We try to be live at 11 a.m. Listen, we may not be in a groove. Our rec soccer team has found a groove. Pathetico Madrid with a bounce back yesterday. Although I do have to say, do you know we won yesterday? Got a text from one of our teammates and friend of the show, Austin, who goes, we were walking out yesterday. And by the way, Pathetico Madrid takes that game 5-3. And he texts me and says, we're walking out yesterday, and Andy goes, tough loss, guys. We'll get them next week.
I thought we lost.
What do you mean? But we won by 2 goals.
Yeah, see, I was clearly confused.
That's a lot of goals in soccer. That's a huge margin.
But I was playing with a fire because I thought that we were down by 2 goals. So I was like, you know what? I was actually going at it. I was pretty amped up because I thought
there were
we were down
30
by
seconds
2
left
goals.
in the game, and you were like, what are we doing? Where's the intensity?
Yeah. But then I found out as we got into the parking lot that we took the dub.
We scored 5 goals, Annie.
Hey, 2 of those assists are mine.
That's true. So you should know that.
That's why I thought we had the 2.
So the only goals that you remember were the goals that you assisted
I was a part
on.
of. Yeah.
Wow.
Kind of a selfish mentality. But
I guess so. We might need to
that.
talk about that at the next team meeting. We don't have team meetings. It's rec soccer. But we might need to now. But for the record, we did win yesterday, just so you are aware.
Yeah, I woke up feeling like a champion.
That's great. Maybe let's save that for the playoffs. But all right, soccer is back on track. We do have to talk about some Orioles things that are not on track, unfortunately. The first, really there are 2 big injuries that we need to talk about with Grayson Rodriguez and Andrew Kittredge. We'll start with Grayson Rodriguez. Received a cortisone injection in his right elbow to combat inflammation. According to the Orioles, the plan was to shut him down for 7 to 10 days. That was, I think, on Sunday, and then they were going to reevaluate after that 7 to 10 day period, kind of just letting the cortisone shot do its thing. Hopefully the inflammation goes down, and Grayson Rodriguez might be avoiding a longer-term injury. I think anytime that you hear elbow injury, your mind goes to the worst-case scenario for obvious reasons. I think Orioles fans specifically have valid reasons to be worried about an injury like this. I'm not saying that these things are the same. I don't know the intricacies of it, but it makes you think of a Kyle Bradish type of injury where there was something going on in spring training. He was trying to work through it. He was getting the cortisone injections. He was trying to push through whatever pain he was feeling. Ultimately only made a few starts last season before he went down with injury, had to get Tommy John surgery, and we are hoping that Kyle Bradish will be back at some point in the back end of this season. That is nightmare scenario for Grayson Rodriguez, and you are hoping that there are not parallels between those 2 things. Nonetheless, it is concerning.
Yeah, the plus side is that they've kind of stated that it isn't a ligament kind of thing, but
that's the major difference there, obviously.
The big difference, but still definitely going to be a day-to-day type of thing for Grayson, especially as he's coming out of after this post kind of effect of the cortisone shot. So we won't know for sure for at least a week to 10 days after Sundays. But it does make you darn glad that the O's went and got 2 depth piece pitchers for the starting rotation in the offseason. It's exactly why they did that, and it's exactly why we stated that as a big need for the O's front office in the offseason was to get depth rotation pieces in the offseason, and that's exactly what kind of was the downside of starting going into last season with all the rotation injuries. But then this year, you kind of clearly are really, really glad that you have Morton and Sugano to be able to heed that rotation depth.
Yeah, and I think that conversation is a bit twofold, right? Because I know a lot of Orioles fans in the offseason were hoping that there was going to be a bigger splash at the top end of the rotation. You had Zach Eflin and Grayson Rodriguez, 2 guys who at their best can be number 1 pitchers in a rotation, and I think at a median range are probably a good number 2. And then you had a few guys in Charlie Morton, Tomoyuki Sugano, Dean Kramer, who probably don't profile with as much of a high upside as those 2 frontline starters, but are still really good pieces. And so you could look at that rotation and say, man, would be nice to have an ace caliber starter. Of course, it's nice to have an ace caliber starter. There are only about a dozen of those in baseball, if that. They're hard to come by. But you're right. This does emphasize the importance of bringing in Morton and Sugano, 2 pitchers who you didn't break the bank for and are not, the number 1 type of pitcher that you may have been looking for. But even with Grayson Rodriguez going down, you have enough depth where you feel like you are okay. Of course, later down the line, once you get towards the playoffs and you're in an AL East push in August, and you're going to hope that Grayson Rodriguez is back and is healthy for that. You can still win a lot of games having just a rotation of a bunch of good starters. Yeah. And that's what the Orioles have right now. Morton and Sugano, I'm sure we will touch on them later. They have been excellent in spring training. And with Rodriguez going down, your number 5 options are Albert Suarez, who looked really good last year, and Cade Povich, who in his last 5 starts in September had a 2-something ERA and has a lot of upside. Those are really good options for the 5th spot in your rotation if Grayson Rodriguez starts the year on the injured list. And those 2 guys are your 5th options because you have Morton and Sugano that have shored up this rotation. Dean Kramer, Zach Eflin have, at least thus far, fingers crossed, gotten through spring training healthy as well. So you have 4 guys that you still feel really good about. And now you have 2 guys still battling for the 5th spot in the rotation that I think you would both feel pretty good about going into the season. So it's obviously you don't want to lose Grayson Rodriguez, but the moves that the Orioles made this offseason put them in a spot where they can manage this.
Right, and like you said, you can definitely make it to a certain point until you say get Grayson Rodriguez back and even get Kyle Bradish back later in what seems like their own kind of
Tyler
deadline.
Wells, too.
Yeah, Tyler Wells, exactly. So the rotation that it is right now with Povich and Suarez definitely being those 2 candidates for that 5th spot is still a solid rotation. Yeah. I mean, you're confident in Eflin, you're confident in Sugano and Morton on what we've seen so far from them in spring training, and everything that we've seen has been exactly as advertised for them because we both know you all know what you're going to get from those 2 guys. But the next topic of discussion, and something that is tricky to grasp on at this point in time because it seemed like the roster was set and the rotation was set, and then obviously the injury plague that we thought we left in 2024 is hitting again right now. So that is definitely a tough thing to wrap your head around. But you do have 2 solid options in Povich and Suarez. I think you would like to think that they could add Povich to get a lefty in there, and he showed some good flashes last season, especially late in the last month when you want someone to be performing at their best late in the season. But then Suarez was that guy who you were confident enough to bring in and out of the bullpen and have him as a swingman, and definitely proved his worth last year, especially being the guy that kept this rotation afloat last year amid all these injuries. But you do have 2 really good options, and it'll come down to if they keep Suarez in the bullpen, like they very well could, especially with the Kittredge injury, or if you want to leave Povich and make sure that you don't have to, because Suarez doesn't have any options left. It's a whole kind of thing, and I'm sure we're going to get into it a little bit more now.
Yeah, I mean, both guys have been good in spring training, Povich and Suarez. Albert Suarez has appeared in 4 games and has looked really solid. Last 2 have been starts, and he has looked great in those starts. Cade Povich has started 2 games, only gone 5 innings, but he's allowed 1 hit, struck out 7, and walked 1.
Yeah.
So he's doing about as much as he can as well, and he'll get another turn in the rotation here, in the spring rotation, before we get to the regular season, maybe even 2 more starts. I think I would lean Povich as well, because Povich, as you mentioned, it would be nice to have a lefty in the rotation. It's not the same thing as a bullpen where you need a mix of righties and lefties, but it is nice to have a lefty in the starting rotation. He was excellent in the month of September last year. He doesn't really have anything left to prove at AAA Norfolk, and this feels like an opportunity where you can see what you have in Cade Povich for the future, where maybe there's not a huge gap between what he and Albert Suarez can give you. And I think your second point there, and we'll get to this Andrew Kittredge injury, but Albert Suarez may turn into a relatively high leverage reliever for you. You could keep him as a swingman, and you could keep him as an option to, be in cleanup duty a little bit if you need somebody to come in for 3 or 4 innings at a time. I wouldn't be surprised if Brandon Hyde opts to do that, because Albert Suarez can come in. You can almost half stretch him out every few days when you need to have somebody go 3 or 4 innings in a blow-up game. But Andrew Kittredge wasn't the high-leverage right-handed reliever, but with Felix Bautista, his status still up in the air for opening day. I know Felix joked with Rock Kabako while he was signing autographs for fans that, oh yeah, he was ready to go for opening day. It's not going to be 100% up to Felix. Obviously, he is going to want to be out there. With Felix Bautista probably not pitching back-to-backs for a while, that moves Sir Anthony Dominguez, I would imagine, into a role where he is closing a decent amount of nights. Whether that's a combination of Sir Anthony Dominguez and Gregory Soto, I'm not sure. Gregory Soto has closing experience there as well, but there's going to be some mix of, I think, Dominguez and Soto being the guys that close games when Felix Bautista doesn't go back-to-back nights. So that domino effect means that, okay, if you are pushing Sir Anthony Dominguez into a role where he might be closing games occasionally, that bumps Sir Anthony out of the 7th, 8th inning role as a right-hander. That role was designated for Andrew Kittredge. He was one of the best set-up men in baseball last year. He doesn't have a ton of experience closing games. That was going to be his role. In the 7th, 8th inning, if you had a bunch of righties coming up on the other side, Andrew Kittredge was going to be your guy. So if you don't have Sir Anthony Dominguez there because he's closing the game, and you don't have Andrew Kittredge there,
why not
Albert Suarez there in that situation? It's a good right-handed arm. There are not a ton of other high-end right-handed options in this Orioles bullpen right now. Albert Suarez could be that guy if you opt to put Cade Povich in the starting rotation.
Yeah, and I also think that because we've seen decent outings from Suarez in both roles, then it makes sense that if you have 2 options that are fighting for a 5th spot in the rotation, but hey, you also need someone, you could use someone else in the bullpen. It just kind of makes sense in that sense. Povich also, he does have options left, so you could also argue that Hyde and the front office is going to put Suarez in that 5th rotation spot and maybe just wait to see until when you get Grayson back and then throw Suarez into the bullpen. But I also would not be surprised at all if we see Povich in that 5th rotation spot, Suarez in the bullpen, both of which have showed really good flashes this spring and last season. It's just a matter of where you're going to piece them and what you're going to do, because there's also some other room in this bullpen for other guys, which we're going to talk about when we start talking about the Andrew Kittredge injury fully in depth. But 2 really impressive guys that could fill that 5th rotation spot, but I would lean towards Povich being that 5th starter and Suarez in the bullpen. Yeah,
and it seems to firmly be a 2-man competition right now, given the injuries to Chase McDermott and Trevor Rogers. I think those 2 guys would have been in this conversation had it not been for spring injuries. I think Povich and Suarez still would have been the leaders in the clubhouse there for the 5th spot in the rotation, but we'll see what the timelines are for McDermott and Rogers. Those guys could be options down the line as well. But let's get into Kittredge. We've talked about the bullpen here a little bit, but they will not be having Kittredge for a while. Brock Kabako reporting that the hopeful timeline is sometime around the All-Star break for Andrew Kittredge to return from surgery on his left knee. He is going to be out for multiple months. That is a big blow. because going into the season, I really viewed the Kittredge signing as one of the best moves that the Orioles made this offseason. As I said, he was one of the best setup men in baseball last year. Not somebody who was going to close a lot of games, but he could take a lot of pressure off guys like Seranthony Dominguez, Gregory Soto, Cianel Perez, whoever you might be seeing in that 7th, 8th inning, Yennier Cano as well. So, I think Kittredge really could have taken the burden off there. And as I mentioned before, too, if Felix is not, going back-to-back, you are pushing Seranthony Dominguez into that 9th inning role. And as I forgot to mention earlier, it's really just Yennier Cano as a high-leverage right-handed arm. Didn't mean to forget about him there in that conversation, but you would like more options there, and Kittredge would have been a really good one.
Yeah, and it's not like it seemed like the O's needed to, we talked about adding a reliever as a need, but it was lower down on our list for something that the O's front office needed to do in the offseason, because the bullpen as a unit already was really, really strong, especially when you're getting Felix back, hopefully, by opening day. And just adding Kittredge really just elevated that bullpen to an entire different level, especially with his chase rates. That was really something really exciting for him. His high leverage situational performances, like you mentioned before, it really just elevated it, and it is something. It's just clearly bad news, especially for a guy who's starting with a new club and a club who's starting with a guy that you would hope to fill those 7th and 8th innings.
Yeah.
I do think that it does help that you have Suarez as that depth to be able to fill those shoes, especially as a swingman, but maybe to get into those high leverage situations. But there are some other options like Brian Baker, Matt Bowman, Roansy Contreras. So you do have some options, and it's not like... Yes, it's a big blow, but the bullpen was already strong to begin with. Kittredge just made it a lot better.
Yeah, it was, as you mentioned, it wasn't super high on our priority list that the Orioles needed to go out and get a bullpen arm. But once you added Kittredge, it was like, oh, man, that was a really good move. That was a really good piece to add. And it does open up some question marks here. If you are assuming that Suarez is making the bullpen, as you mentioned, I think Baker, Contreras, and Bowman are probably the leaders in the clubhouse to be the 8th man in this bullpen. Baker and Contreras probably have the edge over Bowman simply because they are on the 40-man roster already. Matt Bowman was a non-roster invite, even though he was on the team a lot last year, pitched well at times. He was still a non-roster invite to spring training. So Baker and Contreras being on the roster gives them a bit of a leg up. Contreras, during spring training, has been stretched out a little more. They are stretching him out as a starting pitcher, and I think it seems like the plan for Contreras is to be a starter, I don't think, in the big leagues. So Brian Baker is probably going to be the guy there. He's been penciled in by most. We've heard a lot about, his velocity in the offseason as well. Working on a new changeup, as reported by Andy Costco, the Baltimore Banner. So, there are a lot of things to like about Brian Baker's stuff. He had really good spring numbers before the unfortunate, last outing where he allowed 3 home runs. It's just one outing. There's not going to be a ton of stock there. And Brian Baker is not going to be your highest leverage right-handed reliever. You have Felix Bautista. You have Yennier Cano. Even without Andrew Kittredge, you still have right-handed options with Bautista, Cano, and Seranthony Dominguez. So it's not going to be a super consequential 8th spot in the bullpen. Sure would like it if that was Andrew Kittredge, but I could see the Orioles starting out with Brian Baker. It may not be a super long leash with guys like Bowman and Contreras at AAA Norfolk if they remain in the organization ready to go. So I would imagine Baker probably gets that spot for opening day. That's just the guess right now.
Yeah, and to your point on he's definitely probably not going to be that high leverage situation guy because he only has 3 games under his belt in 2024 in high leverage situations, according to Baseball Reference. But regardless, there's still going to be space on this bullpen roster for Baker now, and I think that Baker definitely leads that charge and that conversation. Like you mentioned, Bowman would be higher up if he didn't already, if he wasn't already on a minor league deal. So you could keeping him at AAA just makes sense because it doesn't risk an option for Bowman. But he did have a very strong outing on Monday, so with 4 Ks in a scoreless 1 2/3 innings. So definitely a small sample size, but you'd like to see more of Bowman, and we will see more of him throughout the rest of the regular season, later in the regular season. But when it comes to Baker, yes, that 1-3 home run game is definitely not something you want to pay attention to. But before that, it was 0 hits across 3 innings before that. And you are trying not to put too much stock in spring training games because it is a very different breed than what we'll see in regular season. But it is still, when it comes down to these situations, you're basing who could be that extra roster spot on their spring training.
And there comes a point where you unfortunately kind of have to evaluate spring games to a certain extent. Guys like Brian Baker and Matt Bowman are fighting for a roster spot. Yep. So, yeah, for a lot of guys, spring stats don't make all that much of a difference. You're not going to be worried about the fact that somebody like Jordan Westburg is not hitting all that well in spring training.
Or Suarez.
Okay, great. Jordan Westburg isn't hitting all that well in spring training, right? That's fine. For those guys, they are just getting their work in. They're ramping up however they need to. But for Baker and Bowman, they're trying to make this team. So it is unfortunate that we have to put more stock than we probably should in a 3-homer outing for Brian Baker. But that's unfortunately the nature of spring training sometimes.
Yeah, and even with that, he's still definitely the leader in the clubhouse for that other spot.
I would say so as well. So assuming that Cade Povich makes the roster, if Grayson Rodriguez starts the year on the injured list, there's still a chance that Grayson comes back after the cortisone shot and his elbow is fine and he doesn't start the year on the injured list. That feels a little overly optimistic. So assuming that, let's say Cade Povich makes this rotation, Albert Suarez is in the bullpen, that would just leave one roster spot for somebody like Brian Baker in the Orioles bullpen, and then of course that other spot going to Cade Povich, another guy that we didn't project to make the team. Yeah,
and you're definitely hoping that Felix makes it as well, because otherwise then you're probably going to get Baker and Bowman.
Yeah,
Baker and Roansy Contreras.
Yeah, that's a different conversation. If Felix Bautista does not make the team on opening day.
So far, so good.
He seems to be on track. I think Brandon Hyde is being a little bit more conservative
cautious.
His estimates for him, just because you don't want to put the cart before the horse with a guy that has missed a ton of time with injury. Obviously, Felix Bautista wants to be back. He wants to be there for opening day. He wants to be pitching. You're going to be really careful with him. He is one of the most dominant relievers in baseball. You don't need to rush him back for, I'm not going to say meaningless games in April, but relatively meaningless games in April compared to what you need him for down the stretch. So the Orioles are not going to rush Felix Bautista if he is not 100%. He's not going to be out there for opening day. And it might take a few weeks to ramp him back up. You take that if it means he is healthy for the entire season and feeling like himself down the stretch. That is obviously the priority there. Felix Bautista is one injury that we don't have a ton of clarity on in terms of his opening day status, and we are hoping for the best. And another one is Gunnar Henderson. Brandon Hyde said the other day that they are unsure of the timetable, but he's doing really well. That's all the reports that we've gotten about Gunnar Henderson. He's in the cage, and he looks great, and he feels great, and he's doing this, and he's doing that, and we still don't know when we're going to see him in spring games. This really could be nothing, but the fact that it's Gunnar Henderson just makes it something.
Feels like something.
We don't know either, for the record. There is nothing about this injury that we are not telling you guys. We just don't know a lot about it. It seems like he is working out and feeling good and working his way back. We still don't know what the timetable looks like. And the Orioles, as many other teams would be, are probably just hesitant to give an exact timeline because all of a sudden, if he doesn't make that timeline, then there's panic, right? So there's no need to put a set timeline on a guy who, again, you are prioritizing his long-term health. You need him for the season. If he misses a week at the beginning of the season, okay. If it means he is healthy for the rest of the year. But it does open up an interesting conversation about who the heck plays shortstop. Because Jorge Mateo has been injured in spring training, and he would be your backup shortstop. After Jorge Mateo and Gunnar Henderson, who you were hoping would play 160 games out of the 162-game season, who plays shortstop?
Yeah, I mean, to clarify, it's a strained right intercostal muscle. Which
I don't know what that is.
Your rib cage
I wasn't going to say it.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Sure.
But if there's any way to describe this, it is the epitome of going to be a day-to-day basis for this one, which is really kind of frustrating, but also gives you a little bit of glimmer of hope as well. So, but you're right. Jorge Mateo, if healthy, would be that usual backup shortstop option. As of right now, you have Jordan Westburg, who hasn't really had that many reps at the big league level with the O's at shortstop, but has had some in college.
Yep.
Jackson Holliday, it is his natural position and was growing up, but you have him almost perfected second base for him in his eyes, like what he's gotten to be able to work through. They've all been reps and practice at second base. So are you going to kind of make that a little bit more confusing and shift him? I think he is athletic enough and has the ability, having it been his natural position growing up, to be able to play shortstop, and he will for at least some time now throughout spring training. And then you also have some options in maybe Livan Soto, who, albeit had a small sample size last season, but did pretty well for that, and has been doing well in camp this year. So those are kind of the options when you don't have Jorge Mateo.
Yeah, it's hard to have this conversation not knowing what Gunnar Henderson's status is, because if he makes the opening day roster and is fine, then none of this is a big deal, right? You mentioned Jackson Holliday. Brandon Hyde saying that Jackson is going to be playing shortstop periodically for the rest of camp, so he seems to be the backup option. As you mentioned, I was curious as to whether or not the Orioles would want to do that, because they spent so much time trying to get his footwork down at second base. You quite literally have to flip everything from what you are doing at shortstop. It's just different footwork turning a double play. It's different footwork turning to second base. You're turning the opposite direction. There's just a bunch of differences there. But as you said, Jackson Holliday is a good enough athlete, and shortstop is his natural position. So it should be like riding a bike for him to go back to shortstop. It's just you don't want to mess up any of the footwork that he is getting down at second base. You mentioned Jordan Westburg, too. I think that is a really good option. You said he played at Mississippi State. He did. He also played throughout the minor leagues as well. He played 33 games at shortstop in AAA in 2023. If you remember, Westburg was kind of rotating around between third base, second base, and shortstop throughout the minor leagues, because he was kind of always at the same level with a few of Joey Ortiz, Connor Norby, Gunnar Henderson. There were just always guys that you wanted to get reps at shortstop. So Jordan Westburg was a bit all over the place. I think he could be a good shortstop option as well. Ramon Urias, he's played shortstop. He hasn't played there since 2022. So I think it's probably between Westburg and Jackson Holliday. It seems like Jackson Holliday is going to be the choice from Brandon Hyde here, assuming that, you know, he gets more reps at the position during spring training. Jordan Westburg did play 2 games at shortstop last year, so maybe that's an option as well. But again, the conversation is moot if Gunnar Henderson is just ready for opening day. So I think there are plenty of roster discussions that we could have. You mentioned Livan Soto as a guy who's been playing really well in spring training. There are a bunch of guys who have been playing well in spring training that could factor into that infield conversation. Emmanuel Rivera has had a really nice spring training. So if you wanted to, you could theoretically put Emmanuel Rivera at third base, put Jordan Westburg at shortstop, put Jackson Holliday at second. Or you could just, you could grab another position player and you could have Jackson at short, Ramon Urias at second base, Jordan Westburg at third, and just have a depth infielder wherever you want. Or a depth outfielder if you wanted to. You could really do, whatever you wanted to position-wise in that instance. So the hope is just that Gunnar Henderson is not out very long and he's ready for opening day, and there isn't a roster conversation that we need to have. So I think the general takeaway is we'll table it for a little while. If we need to have that conversation, we will. And hopefully we don't, because Gunnar Henderson is a top 5 MVP candidate in the American League, and if he's not playing on your team as often as you want him to, then that's a big problem.
Right, and we don't even know the timeline for Jorge Mateo either, because he has been progressing pretty well as well. It still feels unlikely for opening day, but he had a full session of defensive drills 2 days ago. Still gunning for that opening day target, but will likely start on the injured list, which just kind of makes a little bit more sense for his recovery timeline. But still very good signs to see him continuing to progress. I wouldn't be surprised if it is early on into the season that we do see him back. And even whatever happens with Gunnar Henderson, you would really hope that Jorge Mateo would also be close behind as well.
Yeah, hopefully. Hopefully the Orioles have options at shortstop because, I mean, they still do. Jackson Holliday, Jordan Westburg can play there, but there's not a natural fill-in. Oh, of course, that's our backup shortstop.
Yeah.
They're both injured right now, which is not great. So hopefully they will both be back soon, and we won't have to worry about Gunnar Henderson not being on this opening day roster because that would stink. All right, well, we've talked for about half an hour about bad
Injuries.
news. Should we talk for maybe the last 10 minutes here about some decent news that's been happening at spring training?
Yes,
all right,
please.
Let's start on the pitching side of things because
Okay.
that was the major bad news of the day with Grayson Rodriguez and Andrew Kittredge. So let's start with some positives. We talked about a few of them in that Cade Povich and Albert Suarez have looked really good in spring training. And we mentioned it a little bit, but Sugano and Morton have both looked really, really good so far this spring.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned before, they've come exactly as advertised. You have Sugano, which you knew was going to be very, very much a command elite control guy, and that's what we're seeing so far. He's in 7 innings in exhibition games. Sugano has a whip of .860 in those 7 innings and 7 strikeouts. For Morton, is also as advertised. This is a very, very seasoned veteran in MLB and someone that is going to bring this experience to this ball club. He also has a whip of .830 in 6 innings and 5 strikeouts. So definitely these two guys have really shown exactly why that they were brought to this ball club, and you're really, really happy to have them in that starting rotation.
Yeah, 13 innings, no runs.
Yeah.
That works.
I'll take it.
Tomoyuki Sugano, the command is as advertised too, as you said. I mean, we saw him in bullpens. We saw the reaction from Gary Sanchez where he said he could basically close his eyes and the ball would be exactly where he wanted to.
That was the quote of spring training.
It might have been. And Sugano, watching him pitch, he just gets guys out in different ways. It's not the traditional strikeout stuff, but like facing a left-handed hitter, a backdoor cutter that just like starts as a ball, just narrowly clips the edge of the strike zone. The dude just knows how to pitch, and he knows how to pinpoint spots. And that's going to be effective against big league hitters. I know the concerns where the fastball velocity is not exactly where you want it to be. But if he can do stuff like that and throw a lot of pitches that look like balls that just sneak into the strike zone, and he has that precision every time, I mean, that's just going to work.
Yeah.
That's just going to work. And we know what Charlie Morton is. He is going to give you a solid ERA. He is going to post 30 times out of the year. That's what you need out of Charlie Morton. And both of these guys have looked good. They are both handling their business. They are both veterans. They have been around the block, whether it's here or in Japan. Like, they know how this thing works.
Right.
And Grayson Rodriguez is down. Yes, maybe Grayson had the highest upside of anybody in this rotation, but Sugano and Morton seem to have an incredibly high floor. And if they post 30 times this year, that is huge.
Yeah,
for this Orioles
I was going to say, if
rotation.
there was ever a time that consistency was needed from a starter, it is now, and you're really hoping. And what we've seen from Morton in his previous seasons is that he will be able to give that to you, and that is going to be huge for this rotation moving forward, especially after last year's injuries and so far.
Yeah, you're coming off a
right
season
now.
where one guy had 30 starts.
Yeah.
If you can have 2 guys with 30 starts, maybe even 3 guys with 30 starts, don't want to get greedy, but that would be really, really nice. And Sugano and Morton's floor seems to really raise the floor of this team as well.
Also, something random to note that is kind of crazy is that Albert Suarez had the second most starts in this rotation last season.
Yeah.
It was he and Dean Kramer, and then Suarez had the second most innings pitched out of anyone in the ball club last season, which is crazy because that guy just flew under the radar.
Yep.
And you're really hoping that he can be that swingman kind of guy again or high leverage guy in the bullpen from opening day.
Also, I know Suarez has a 7.50 ERA this spring, and I
Don't
said he
pay
looked
attention
good.
to it.
No, he still looked good. I don't
Yeah.
care. The last 2 outings where he is like ramping up to be a starting pitcher and he is in competition for the 5th spot in the rotation, he's been great. So 7.50 ERA, don't care. He's looked good.
He had 6 Ks and 0 walks in 4 innings yesterday. That was the most innings of an Orioles starting pitcher in spring training.
Looked
so
good.
far.
Don't care about the 750. All right. Let's move on to the Orioles catchers because they oh my goodness, words are hard. They may be the greatest catching duo on the planet.
Yeah.
Samuel Basallo and Adley Rutschman are both having absurdly good spring training. Samuel Basallo is a monster. Some of those home runs are ridiculous from Samuel Basallo. Adley Rutschman is hitting everything under the sun. I know Samuel Basallo is not going to break camp with the team. I don't care how much you tweet at us. Samuel Basallo still needs more than like 20 games at AAA Norfolk before he makes a big league roster, and you have Adley Rutschman and Gary Sanchez, and they are both really good. However, he is going to be a really good big leaguer. Adley Rutschman is already a really good big leaguer. They both have an OPS over 1,000 in spring training. Samuel Basallo has 2 home runs. Adley Rutschman is getting on base at a 500 clip and hitting 409. Good. Good catchers.
These guys are no joke.
No.
I mean, it's not even just offensively, because with Basallo, there was always that kind of defensive question marks, but you've seen a lot of characteristics in his defense this spring training that have improved a lot year over year. But when you talk about the bat for Basallo is genuinely no joke. I mean, 113 miles per hour off the bat on Monday in a 3-run homer. And that wasn't even his furthest home run this spring training.
Yeah.
403 feet apparently seemed a little short for this home run.
Yep.
Everyone, including Jackson Holliday, said that StatCast that said 403 feet was probably wrong because it looked and felt so much further. But Basallo is just... you are so excited to see Adley and Basallo as a catching duo right now, because you think about in a year or so what they're going to look like together, and that's just a really, really cool thing to think about.
Yeah, whenever Samuel Basallo gets here, he's going to be a factor immediately.
Yeah. And
the bat is immediately going to translate.
And I don't want to see any more people saying that they should trade him for a starting pitcher at the trade deadline, because
nonsense. We yelled at you last year, and we're going to do it again.
Is an untouchable if untouchable was ever a thing.
We went through too many comments last year in our comment section saying trade Samuel Basallo for pitching. No. No. He's on the team. He's really good.
Yep.
He's going to be really good. And in 2 years, when he has 7,000 home runs, you're going to be glad that you didn't trade him for half a year of starting pitching, and you're going to think about the bird's nest when we yelled at you and said you don't trade Samuel Basallo, and you were going to go, wow, I sure am glad I listened to that great podcast every Wednesday at roughly 11 a.m. And
sometimes
they told me to not trade Samuel Basallo. They are not the only guys that have been having nice numbers at the plate. A lot of young guys have looked good. Heston Kjerstad, Jackson Holliday have been putting up nice offensive numbers. A lot of depth guys have been looking good, too. I mean, Daz Cameron has been solid. He's hitting .368 so far this spring. We mentioned Emmanuel Rivera. There are just a bunch of depth guys that look good. And even though all of them aren't going to make the big league roster, you have a lot of depth pieces at AAA Norfolk. And coming off a season where you needed just a lot of guys to get through a full season, whether it was on the pitching side especially, or, you know, even position player-wise, you needed that depth. Livan Soto and Emmanuel Rivera were playing important games down the stretch. And so you need guys like that. You need the Daz Camerons and the Emmanuel Riveras and the Livan Sotos to be there at the ready, even if it is at AAA Norfolk to start the year. And if somebody goes down, you feel good about those guys and what they've shown you thus far, and that they might be able to come up at some point in the regular season and give you solid numbers.
Right, and some guys that kind of feel like a little bit more of a stretch, but who have been performing very well in spring training are Luis Vasquez and Vimial Machine, because they have been performing very, very well, and kind of to much surprise of many that these guys, either defensively or at the bat, have been, or at the plate, have been doing exceptionally well for who they are and kind of the expectations that they held, which were pretty low, but so far they have been exceeding expectations in camp.
Yeah, I mean, you have, a dozen guys in camp so far hitting over 300 in spring games. Of course, there's guys like Hudson Haskin who played one game and he's hitting 1,000. But there are 11, 12 guys that have played a good amount of games and are hitting over 300. Judd Fabian and Dylan Beavers are both hitting really well, too. We talked about that a few weeks ago when we went over, was that last week? I don't remember.
Yes.
Time is a weird concept. Last week, when we were talking about the Orioles top 30 prospects, we mentioned that Judd Fabian and Dylan Beavers had a bit of a murky path to making the big leagues this year and making an impact. Not saying that spring training numbers mean everything. We do kind of flip-flop between, hey, they mean a lot, and hey, they don't.
Really
but
do.
we don't put a lot of stock in them because they are, you don't know what kind of pitchers they're facing and things like that. There are more intricate ways that you can track all of those things, but you don't put a ton of stock into it, but it's still nice when the numbers are good.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make that much of a difference to me if there are established big leaguers that are not hitting well. Like I know Cedric Mullins and Ryan O'Hearn and Jordan Westberg are struggling at the plate a little bit. Okay.
Right.
All right, whatever. They're going to be fine. I'm not worried about their spring numbers. Judd Fabian and Dylan Beavers hitting well in spring training. Yeah, it doesn't mean everything. We still need to see them put up better numbers at AAA Norfolk, but it's still nice that they're doing that. Just like Adley Rutschman, again, those numbers are really, really great. It doesn't mean everything. It doesn't mean that he is going to come out of the gates on fire during the regular season and those other guys that I mentioned are not. It's just nice that he's putting up good numbers.
Yeah.
It's good. So there's not a ton of stock in those spring games, but it's just good that it's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. I would say the one last positive note is that Felix Bautista went out for his third outing for the first time since August of 2023 I guess that was on Monday, I think. Yeah, on Monday. And he threw 2 cutters for the first time.
Woo!
And his pitch velocities are upticking ever so slightly. So
yeah,
those are 2 positive notes from him.
Got up to 98.5 mile an hour on the sinker, I believe the number was. So that is encouraging for Felix Bautista. Good to see him ramping back up. Again, the hope with the 2 injuries that are a little bit up in the air in Gunnar Henderson and Felix Bautista are that they are ready for opening day. They are 2 of the most dominant players in the sport, and it's really nice if the Orioles have those guys. Yeah. But look, it's spring training. Guys are going to get hurt. It's not just the Orioles. It happens across baseball. Mid to late March is the time where just some devastating injuries hit, and it's just hard to deal with. I mean, you're going to see it across the game. This is not a Baltimore-specific thing. It's just a tough time, and it happens. And you got to be glad that Mike Elias has built a team with so much depth that, like we said with the starting rotation and like we have talked about with these position players, they're maybe not the highest upside guys in the world compared to who is going down. Grayson Rodriguez and Gunnar Henderson are 2 incredibly high upside players. You are never going to replicate those guys. But you have the depth where you are going to be able to stay afloat until those guys are back. And that is really important. That is how good teams are built, and that is how you don't just lose a bunch of games in April because guys went down and you weren't ready, and now all of a sudden you've dug yourself a hole in the AL East. No, you're going to stay afloat there, and that's what is important in this general discussion of a lot of injuries.
Is the name of the game for 162.
It sure is.
It's a long season.
Oh, yeah. And the season is almost here.
It is so close.
We are only a few weeks away. I think we've got 2 podcasts left before the start of the regular season. Next week, it's going to be another draft. We do that draft every year as well. It's roughly the 40-man roster draft. We're essentially just drafting 2 teams of players that we think are going to have an impact on the big league team this year, and we will come back at the end of the season and see how those teams performed. I kicked Bones' butt last year. He's not here to defend himself, but on those rosters, I might take a victory lap on that before our draft next week. And I think our next podcast after that is just the regular season preview.
Which is wild.
We're going to give out our Orioles rewards. We're going to toss out some predictions.
That's fun.
It's going to be a fun show. And
my first opening day.
I know.
Yeah,
that's
very
exciting.
excited.
And we're going to get you ready for opening day. That'll be the day before the Orioles take on the Blue Jays. So, again, hopefully we will be here at 11 a.m. on our Facebook and YouTube channels. You can tune in with us live. Comment along. We love hearing your comments, even if we are yelling at you about wanting to trade Samuel Basayo. We enjoy
Kobe
doing
Mayo,
that, too.
For that matter.
Yeah, or if you don't catch us live on Facebook and YouTube, you can catch us after the fact on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts or your digital shows. You can find us here on The Bird's Nest, another show where we're flying solo producing. So shout out to us. We're doing it again, I suppose. But I think that'll just about do it. Pat on the back for us, I suppose. We will try to be back next week at 11 a.m. on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Make sure you are tuned in to MASN Orioles social feeds for all of your spring training coverage. But for Annie Klaff, I am Brendan Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.